Welcome to this reading. This is Professor Smith, and I will be recording the book After Polygamy Was Made a Sin, The Social History of Christian Polygamy by John Cairncross. Polygamy was forbidden after Roman papists took over the church. Isaiah 4 tells us the Astra strongholds denying every believing woman a good husband will be overcome at the last. Enjoy, and may the Almighty Yahweh bless you. Okay, welcome, folks. Here we are to Chapter 6, The Virtuous Savage and the Enviable Muslim. So it looks like he's going to go outside the church kind of history, but look at some of the outside kinds of cultures that basically have all along allowed natural law to be a guiding principle. You see this in any kind of herd animal that you have. You would put, one stallion among several mares, one bull among several female cows, and so on. But if growing up in a sort of a horse farm background, it was a very dangerous thing to throw two stallions together in the same field around a bunch of mares. Very dangerous thing. One of them probably would not survive. So, this is what we refer to as natural law. So let's continue on here. There could hardly be a sharper contrast than the one between the French and German approach to polygamy, whereas the latter usually drew their inspiration from the Old Testament and from mystic millennial aspirations. The French concentrated largely on the more generous possibilities of sensual satisfaction. Satisfaction. Let me see if I can get that right. The French concentrated largely on the more generous possibilities of sensual satisfaction opened up for men. Many of the Gaelic writers, too, found in Muslim polygamy a fertile source of erotic material with which to titillate their readers' senses, and they even spiced serious discussions with salacious tales of harems and eunuchs. It must, however, be admitted that the topic of population weighed heavily on the French in their arguments on polygamy, however richly seasoned, just as it did on the English and Germans. Nor is it fair to overlook the role of the virtuous savage, which leads back to the legend of the Golden Age, a rather remote cousin of the millennialist views of perfection. In fact, the first apology for polygamy in France has a definitely utopian ring. It was born of the experiences of a 16th century Protestant settlement in South America and lingers lovingly on the primitive communism of the Indians and their simple virtues. Fittingly enough, the return voyage to France might have come to grief but for a parrot, and it could therefore be argued somewhat fancifully that polygamy made its first entry into French literature thanks to this exotic bird. It was, it is true, a very special parrot, plump as a goose, vociferous as the most uninhibited of sailors, and refulgent in its many-colored plumage. Much care had gone to its selection, for it was to be a present for the Duke of Coligny, Admiral of France and the leader of the French Protestants, but the Duke was never to set eyes on it. The coffin ship, the Jacques, which was bearing it and other exotic creatures back to France from Brazil, went badly off course. After 3 weeks of starvation, all the other specimens, whether fish or fowl, were rapidly devoured. The crew thought themselves fortunate when they laid their hands on a rat, and in the end they were reduced to gnawing the hard, dry Brazil wood for the faintest suspicion of nourishment. John Delary, the parrot's guardian, let me read that again. John Delary, the parrot's guardian, had kept it carefully hidden to prevent it from suffering the same fate as the rest, and he preserved his secret. But the hunger breaks stone walls, and future Calvinist pastor as he was, Delary managed to stifle his qualms of conscience, and the parrot went the same way as the rest. The select group admitted to the feast made a thorough job of it. The innards, even the beak and the claws, were greedily devoured. Nothing was rejected but the feathers. Fortified by this treat, Delary survived to see his native France. Had he perished on the voyage, he would never have written his account of his brief stay among the Indians of Brazil. The omnivorous Montaigne would have lacked some of the most serviceable bricks for the construction of the huge rambling edifice of his essays. It would never have written his epic-making pages on the virtues of the cannibals of the southern hemisphere. Shakespeare would not have borrowed from the Frenchmen his enchanting vision of an idyllic commonwealth in The Tempest, and most important of all, the Acadian vision of a golden age, now visibly realized among the tribes of the Americans, would perhaps not have entered the mainstream of European thought, with its recurrent vision of a return to the womb of the primitive. Delary was not, of course, the first European to admire the qualities of the poor Indian in his untutored mind. Columbus himself first recorded Voyager, the first recorded Voyager, he says Voyager, to America had taken the gentle islanders of the Caribbean, rapidly extinguished by the advent of civilization. But a few explorers had described the natives' waves so fully and with such a flavor of authenticity. The feat is the most impressive since the Frenchmen had spent only some 9 months, looks like 1557 to 1558, among them. He had joined a Calvinist settlement founded by a certain, looks like Villagagnon, who was been granted the high-sounding title of King of America by Henry II of France, and whose name still survives in an island in the Bay of Rio de Janeiro near the site of the colony. Delary was, like all the other settlers, shocked by the utter divergent mores of these tribes and distressed at his failure to make even the slightest dent in their pagan beliefs. The women firmly refused to clothe themselves, and even the slaves divested themselves of the troublesome encumbrances as soon as their masters' backs were turned. But these defects weighed lightly in the balance against the Indians' transparent goodness and innocence. They might, noted Delary, eat their defeated enemies, but at least they did not, like the Europeans, torture their living fellow creatures to death as witches or heretics. They were kindly and hospitable, and above all, they lived an unconstrained and unsophisticated existence. They did not, observe the Frenchmen, swaddle their babies tightly like mummies, a practice that was to persist till Rousseau's violent denunciation of it in the 18th century. Doubtless, as a result of their natural freedom, they had a splendid physique. Even for their obstinately maintained nudity, Delary finds some justification. Unself-conscious nakedness, he notes, is far less likely to incite to lust than the artful alteration of revealment and concealment practiced by his coquettish countrywoman. Women, to his horror, are allowed complete freedom before marriage, but he admits they are faithful to their husbands, and adultery is unknown. What struck Delary most is perhaps the prevalence of polygamy, so utterly contrary to European ideas. Not only is it allowed among the Indians, but the possession of many wives is a status symbol. Those men, he writes, with the largest number, are accounted the most valiant and bold. And he cites the case of one man who had 8 wives and was accustomed to sing his own praises on that account. What is more, there is a complete absence of jealousy over the husband, just as the sense of property hardly exists, being merged in a one-for-all communal spirit. There is no trace of possessiveness among the wives. They are all of them busy about their work and live in an atmosphere of peace that beggars all description. Such succulent exotica found an appreciative audience. One of the book's most devoted readers was a French nobleman, Michel Ecume, who had withdrawn from active life at the age of 38 to meditate in his castle near Bordeaux. Among his beloved books, Montaigne, as he is usually called, I think the pronunciation of Montaigne, I think it's in the French it's Montaigne, but if I'm mispronouncing that, you have to excuse me. I wonder if it's Montaigne, but I think I'm going to go with Montaigne. As he is usually called, chose as his initial motto, Q sais je, what do I know? And is, with Machiavelli and Copernicus, one of the intellectual trinity who undermined the comfortable certainties of the Middle Ages, the men whose new philosophy called all in doubt by systematically questioning all but religious and political propositions, for he was a highly conservative skeptic. He is at the wellspring of modern thought. The fruit of his reflections, first published in 1580, marks the appearance of a new type of literature, as the title, The Essays, indicates. He is assaying or testing the ideas discussed in his book. The result of this new approach is to dissolve the seemingly firm outline of the contemporary pattern of values and to replace it by a fluid constellation of potential alternatives. Quote, truth on one side of the Pyrenees, error on the other, unquote. As he put it in a telling formula, his new and potentially subversive relativity was fed from both within and without. By probing relentlessly into the depths of his own consciousness, I am myself the true subject of this book, he opened up a new era in self-knowledge. But the most incisive weapon in his intellectual armory was the repertory of different and generally admired ways of life of primitive tribes, derived from travelers of the age. It was no accident, then, that the whole passage of Deliri's account, published in 1578, should crop up in Montaigne's famous essay on cannibals. In Montaigne's novel perspective, the tribesmen emerged as far less constrained by irrational and inhuman laws and far more satisfactorily integrated in their communal life than Europeans, and their pagan virtues can often put Christians to shame. The fact that they hold all things in common excludes individual greed and avarice and glaring inequalities and ensures that all members of the community are well looked after. Published in 1578, should crop up in Montaigne's famous essay on cannibals. In Montaigne's novel perspective, the tribesmen emerged as far less constrained by irrational and inhuman laws and far more satisfactorily integrated in their communal life than Europeans, and their pagan virtues can often put Christians to shame. The fact that they hold all things in common excludes individual greed and avarice and glaring inequities. And glaring inequalities, and ensures that all members of the community are well looked after. Montaigne took special note of the Indians' sexual mores. He was acutely aware of the strains and stresses resulting from current morals. In a few famous passages, which were always torn out from copies used by nuns, he pointed up the contrast between an attitude which forced women's feelings exclusively on love and the hard penalties inflicted on them for following their inclinations. Montaigne also saw clearly the innate tension between sex and sophistication. He was struck by the success of proffers of amorous execution by robust and uncomplicated males such as muleteers, whose performance was generally vastly superior to that of more sensitive, agitated, and maladjusted gentlemen. The marriage system of the savages was bound to have a strong appeal to a man of this stamp. Their men, he notes, echoing Deliri faithfully, have many wives. By how much more they are reputed valiant, so much the greater is their number of the wives. And he develops, as did his source, the utter absence of jealousy among the wives. The manner and beauty in their marriages, he notes, is wondrous, strange, and remarkable. Indeed, he goes further than Deliri. It is not merely that the women do not fight over their husband. The same jealousy our wives have to keep us from the love and affection of other women, the same they have to procure it. They endeavor and apply all their industry to having as many rivals as possible they can, for as much as it is a testimonial of their husband's virtue or power. And in a later edition, no doubt still mindful of his source's comments, he adds, our women would count it a wonder, but it is not so. It is a virtue properly matrimonial, but of the highest kind. Montaigne it is true, revels in the dream of a swarm of industrious and affectionate wives contending for the affections of the male, and confers on air of respectability on his sexual fantasies by reminding his readers that Leah, Rachel, Jacob's wives, brought their fairest maidservants to their husbands' beds. In North America, which was for the long and main French colony, morals were much the same as in Brazil. Women were allowed complete license before marriage. Divorce could be easily obtained by husband or wife, and polygamy was the order of the day. A man called Father Cadillac can marry or associate with as many wives as he can feed or maintain. The 7th century trappers, the Coeurs de Bois, as they were called, took full advantage of the flexible Indian marriage structure and had as often as not a wife in each of the villages at which they called in regularly on their rounds. The Jesuits and other French missionaries were understandably less enthusiastic, for sexual freedom was the greatest obstacle to conversion of the Indians. Yet the missionaries, despite their proselytizing zeal, showed treasures of indulgence for their erring flock, largely because they lived in primitive innocence with, quote, all things in common, unquote. If even in Christian marriages the spouses were not spared the tribulations of the flesh, quote unquote, for the pagans or new converts, as Father Lalemant put it in 1639, quote, it is a kind of martyrdom to be tied by an inseparable bond to a husband or wife who is more rasping than a thistle and less gentle than a thorn. And for anyone who has read of the atrocious sufferings of some priests at the hands of the more ferocious tribes, the term martyrdom was no mere metaphor. Okay, and that concludes that section of this chapter. Now we have a section called the Utopias. The virtuousness of the Canadian Indians, as enlarged upon by the missionaries, affected French thought in many ways, for its influence was especially marked in the utopias, which were numerous in the latter half of the 17th century, but were usually too radical to be published in France. These works, like their English counterparts, such as the original Utopia itself, describe imaginary commonwealths where ideals of every sort are realized: political, social, moral, and economic. The polygamy which has been noted among the savages finds its way into these accounts, but it is tempered by the current conceptions. Thus, in the Isle of, it looks like, Severamblis, by Denise Veras, published in 1677, quote, care is taken to see that no one is without women. Polygamy is permitted in the case of the superior officers. Only the viceroy is not limited as to the number of wives. However, it is the custom never to take more than 12. But the common run of people are allowed only one wife and one concubine if the wife is sterile. And if the concubine too is sterile, they may change her as well against another. Sevarambes, however, like their contemporary Europeans, set their faces firmly against polyandry. But it is the it looks like a Histoire de Calahava. This is it might be a French transliteration. He was seized with panic at his daring and destroyed his edition, so that only one copy has survived. Most of the work is of a highly wordy and theoretical nature. He contends that God does not intervene on individual occasions, and hence he disapproves miracles. Human reason is a spark of the divine reason. Virtue is a subordination of the individual to the common good. God demands nothing from us for himself except for us to be happy, unquote. Let's see here. Here's another quote. If the greatest boon God has done us ever is to have created us, says a spokesman of Kalahava, it seems we cannot render a better service to mankind than to cooperate with God in the creation of man, and that the greatest crime of all is to abstain therefrom. We punish it more severely than homicide. We find it more punishable in women than in men, because a man can take the place of several by polygamy, but a woman cannot give birth to those another is charged with engendering. Whereupon a visitor protests that it is cruel to punish women for having lost their honor. And here's the quote. We wish all men to marry, the spokesman continues, and as generation is the main aim of marriage, we do not allow a woman to stay for more than 3 years with a husband without having children by him. Apart from this case, divorce is forbidden, except by consentment between the two parties, or if one of them has good grounds for asking for it. You see that polygamy is allowed among us. Marriage, in fact, says another passage of the book, is obligatory for all in accordance with the law of God and of nature. But pleasure is attached to procreation, and hence women become ill if they resist their vocation. These extracts represent the one instance of a French writer appearing to echo the Munsterite views through John de Leyden, though John de Leyden would certainly have disapproved of the reference to sexual pleasure. It is rather as if one were to stumble on a primitive Serbian icon in a Baroque Venetian church. In fact, the next French text on polygamy take us back to the mainstream of the French utopian thought, which is the unconstrained delights of an island paradise. Okay, and this next section is called the Isle of Bliss within the same chapter. One of these idyllic settings, the more attractive because so far off, was Madagascar. The climate was mild, natural, abundant in all gifts, and the natives were gentle and smiling, and the women were beautiful. Their persons, says an 18th century writer, quote, are slender and genteel. They have pleasing and delicate features, a soft, smooth skin, teeth remarkably white, and fine blue eyes, the pupils of which are brown and sparkling. Polygamy was common, especially among the rich, and all the wives in a plural marriage lived in complete harmony. Divorce offered an easy way out of unharmonious marriages. Adultery was forbidden. But the islanders were happy to offer foreigners their daughters and regarded it as an honor to have offspring from the union. Looks like the Malgache women appear to be happy, says the same writer, and, quote, are generally in good humor, unquote. The reader is therefore not surprised to learn that, quote, their lively and equal temper is particularly pleasing to the Europeans, unquote. But even the fascinating ladies of Madagascar paled in insignificance besides those of the South Sea island of Tahiti, where it was rediscovered by the French captain, looks like Bougainville, in 1768, and by the British captain Cook the following year. The girls in particular were beautiful and ardent. The English talked of, quote, their dark liquid eyes and perfect teeth, of the sprays of jasmine and hibiscus in their hair, and their smiling, welcome faces. They wore brightly colored toga-like garments, which in the evening they dropped to the waist, revealing in the young girls beautifully molded breasts and arms and shoulders. Nor was it merely that the women were enchanting. There was no need for any but the slightest work. Food was there for the picking, quote, since there was no winter, unquote, says Alan Moorhead. They were never cold, and even on the hottest day, the sea breeze blew. They lived from day to day in an endless recreated cycle, controlled only by their hunger and their desires, ashamed of nothing, eating, sleeping, dancing, fishing, cooking, talking, and making love, and always together, and always in the open air. Indeed, Cook noted, both sexes expressed the most indecent ideas in conversation without the least compunction, and they delighted in such conversation beyond any other. The utter lack of inhibitions dazzled the sex-starved sailors making land after months of loneliness in mid-ocean. Their introduction to the island was the vision on the quarterdeck of their ship. Looks like the name of the ship is a French word. The Bedouce. Yeah, no, this is not the name of the ship. This is a French word, bedouce, of a smiling, naked girl. The captain, notes Bougainville, never hove to with more looks like alacrity than on that occasion. The French sailors, when they came ashore, were offered young girls and expected to make love to them in public. Here, says the French captain, Venus is the goddess of hospitality, and every tribute paid to her is a feast for the whole nation. Lecomerson, another member of the crew, exclaims that the inhabitants, quote, no other God than love. No, no other God than love. All their days are devoted to him. The whole island is his temple. All men sacrifice to him. And as for the women, quote, they are the sisters of graces, completely naked, unquote. The perfection of the newly discovered paradise, even further enhanced by the current Rousseauian vogue for the virtuous savage, echoes through the works of the major writers of the time. De Lilly, the fashionable poet, celebrated the island where the natives practiced, quote, love without shame and yet with innocence. Diderot and Voltaire sang the praises of the land where constraint in love, dissension, inequality, and tyranny were unknown. It was inevitable that this celebration of the island's uninhibited hedonism should arouse a counterattack by the Orthodox. Moorhead refers to, quote, the damaging effect on British morals of a frank account of Tahitan promiscuity, unquote. If the island were so perfect, then the idea of progress was nonsense, and Christian morals and education a snare and a delusion. The unregenerate luxury of the South Sea Island was immoral, felt the rigorist, and, quote, had to be denounced, unquote, which it was. But such was the prestige of this sun-drenched Arcady that, conscious or not, some critics adopted the sager course of attenuating the facts or finding excuses for the natives' licentious behavior. Thus, while it was not denied that girls of 10 years and upwards readily made love to strangers, it was explained, with a bland disregard of the different social pattern, that they usually belonged to the lower classes, who formed at least 95% of the population. In the same way, a battle arose over the existence of polygamy. Madon, in his, looks like Philophora, contended that if polygamy existed on this model island, there must be grounds for regarding it as natural. His facts were immediately contested by a certain Cookson, see pages 162 to 3, who appealed to the works of George Forster, a fellow traveler of Cook's. This author stoutly maintained that the system prevailing on the island was monogamous, and so orthodoxy was saved. Forster's word had been accepted by such careful scholars as Moorhead, but he was either mistaken or disingenuous or vague. Polygamy was, and still is in many places, common in the South Seas, especially among the ruling classes. Other observers at the time, who had no moral axe to grind, are explicit on the subject. A French member of Bedouce's crew called Fesch notes, polygamy is allowed in Tahiti. Many of the men have several wives, especially the chiefs, unquote. He adds that wives are faithful, and that any concession on the part of married women to the French was made only with the husband's permission. The existence of polygamy is also confirmed by a much later missionary account published in 1853, which affirms that it was frequent in Tahiti in the unregenerate days before the gospel. Western culture and morals had penetrated the Cimmerian darkness, which overspread the Pacific like a pall. But the same account makes clear that pall had by then, in large part, been dispelled. Polygamy had been rooted out. Female virtue was no longer regarded as a, quote, a thing of little worth, unquote. Nudity was rare, being now covered by Western frippery, especially in the case of some members of the royal family. The missionaries, perhaps unwisely, had endeavored in some respects to deprive, quote, the islanders of music, dancing, social enjoyments, and amusements of which they were extremely fond. The native music had died out and been replaced by God Save the King and other popular English songs. Life was governed by a morality police who imposed a curfew and arrested any stragglers found in the streets after 8 at night. The police regulations were excellent, said this account, without irony, though some might term them severe, quote unquote. In short, the delights of the earthly paradise were rapidly obliterated, and, as is clear from the Gonguin's pictures of its supine, golden creatures, the islanders lost their will to live and came near extinction. And that concludes that section of this chapter. And reader's note here, goodness, I mean, they literally, Western civilization, in their drive to bring Christ to these savages, caused their demise. That in itself is an indictment of the Greco-Roman sister system of churchianity. That in itself is an indictment of the current morals, which really, to be honest, as one of the writers mentioned earlier, defies nature. I think I mentioned that at the beginning of this reading, and it's really quite a tragic thing, isn't it? And it's interesting, I should add this also, that this condition is noted all throughout the scriptures, that there comes this counter movement, this orthodoxy, and I use that in a sense of the papist movement, to where they have this austere kind of view of what Christian morality should be, even though it is completely antithetical to the freedoms that God's law, God's own law, allows us. And to be honest, it's a tragedy, and it's really a sad thing to behold and even read about. Okay, so let's go on now to Lords of the Harem. In the Shangri-La of Tahiti, polygamy was only a fringe benefit, a minor aspect in the overall sexual liberty of the islander. It did not imply the claustration of women or proclaim the natural superiority of the male. On the contrary, in its overheated visions of Islam, the 18th century dwelt insistently and voluptuously on the conjugal privileges of the Moslem husband. The Oriental was enviously pictured as lord and master of an indeterminate number of submissive and adoring wives or concubines who rushed to satisfy his slightest caprice. The inmates of the harem, shielded from prying eyes, were reserved for his exclusive pleasure, and the slightest suggestion of rebellion was immediately crushed by forbidding and sadistic eunuchs, whose own sexual frustration underlined the proprietorial absolutism of their ruler. This looks like this is a French term. Once fantasy of male domination was given its classic formulation by the Persian letters of Montesquieu, 1721. It is unquestionably a masterpiece and deservedly met with an immediate and universal success. Part of the work's popularity, however, is ascribable to its erotic piquancy, which forms a marked contrast with the gravity of the author, a distinguished magistrate who understandably decided to publish the book anonymously. It relates the travels of Uzbek and his friend Rika to Europe. But Uzbek remains in touch not only with his closest acquaintances, but also with his harem as Isfahan, where specifically with his chief eunuchs and his wives. About a quarter of the letter deals with the seraglio. They exude a pervasive and insinuating eroticism. Letter 2 plunges the reader into a Persian bath of torrid sensuality. It is addressed to the first black eunuch. You are the faithful guardian, quote unquote. It begins, quote, of the most beautiful women of Persia, unquote. It is matched by subsequent letters to the first white eunuch, one of which, 21, begins, quote, tremble as you open this letter. The leading wife, Roxanne, too, is very much of the fore. She complacently evokes the beauty competition between the various inmates of the harem. Let me read that again. The beauty competition between the various inmates of the harem as they displayed their naked charms in order the better to entice their master and become his favorite. Such highly spiced episodes abound. One raises the acquisition of a new slave, writes the chief black eunuch. And it looks like there's a quote here. Yesterday, some Armenians brought to the seraglio a young female slave girl whom they wished to sell. I had her taken to the secret apartments, undressed her, and examined her with a critical eye. And the more I examined her, the more graceful I found her. A virginal bashfulness seemed to seek to conceal her charms from my sight. I saw what an effort it was for her to obey. She blushed to see herself naked, even in front of me, who am exempt from passion. As soon as I had deemed her fit for you, I lowered my eyes and threw her a mantle of scarlet. Unquote. Equally stimulating and morbid is the emphasis on the role played by the eunuchs, their turbid mentality, torn between their feelings of impotence and their desire to seek compensation by imposing their will on the ravishing creatures in their charge. The embarrassment of one of them who has yielded to the temptation of caressing a woman as she is being taken to the baths, the sick desire of one of the younger eunuchs to marry a female slave, the unsuccessful attempts at a forcible castration of a youth to render him fit for service in the harem. Sadistic touches are not lacking. There is a casual dispatch of a couple of men who had the ill luck to be on the route of the harem inmates, went on an outing into the country, and the punishments imposed by the eunuchs on the wives for disobedience to the master's orders. All these scenes are ostensibly described by Uzbek, his eunuchs or his wives, but they are touched in with such conviction and enjoyment that one might be forgiven for visualizing their author as a salacious voyeur wallowing complacently in steamy daydreams. Montesquieu was, after all, not the first public figure to indulge in such diversions, nor the first husband of an overcompetent and unloved wife to seek compensation in fantasy, though he found it in concrete form as well. However, there is another side of the book. Its main aim is to point up the weaknesses and absurdities of 18th century France by portraying it with a careful, calculated, looks like naivety. I think it's being naive. It's a form of naive in the English language. As seen throughout the untutored foreign eyes of the Persian visitors, and whenever possible, with the piquant counterpoint of the Moslem way of life. Thus, the lax morals of Paris are shown in the most unfavorable light when compared with the serene and undisturbed life of the harem. Quote, a husband who seeks to claim sole possession of his wife should be looked upon here as a disturber of the peace. A husband who loves his wife is a man who has not enough merit to secure another woman's love. Unquote. Morals are utterly different in the harems. Morals are utterly different in the harems of Isfahan. Okay, so here's a quote from that. How happy you are, writes Uzbek to Roxanne, to be in the sweet land of Persia, and not in these pestiferous climates, where neither modesty nor virtue is known. You live in my seraglio as in the abode of innocent, and accessible to the approaches of all mortals, you are in the happy position of being powerless to succumb, even before a man has soiled you with his lascivious look. Unquote. As an ardent Muslim, Uzbek is naturally delighted to note that the Christian infidels are gradually seeing the light and realizing the blessings of polygamy. Has not one of their doctors written a book called Polygamia Triumphatrix? Looks like Triumphatrix. However, halfway through the book, 57 to 8, Uzbek suddenly loses his zeal for the harem and becomes the undisguised mouthpiece of the author. For, with a very un-Islamic fervor, he maintains that polygamy is responsible for the present catastrophe decline in population since Roman times. Quote, 600 years from now, writes Uzbek Montesquieu. In other words, this is he is resonating Montesquieu. I think that's what the author intends. Quote, the world will be a desert if things continue at the present rate, unquote. True, he denounces Christianity for having introduced the celibacy of the clergy and banned divorce, thus tying sterile couples together. But polygamy is the main culprit. Quote, wives, unquote, says the prophet, are the husband's clothes, unquote. Thus, affirms Montesquieu, is a precept which makes the life of a genuine Muslim very heavy going. For anyone with the 4 wives sanctioned by law, I think he's speaking of Islamic law, and even only as many slaves again must surely, quote, be stifled under such clothes, unquote. And he goes on, quote, I look at a good Muslim as an athlete designed to fight unceasingly, but who soon flags, even on the field of victory, and is, so to speak, buried under his own triumphs, unquote. In short, a large number of wives is more calculated to exhaust them to satisfy. And Montesquieu points to the frequency with which a prodigious seraglio produces only a handful of children most of them alien and stunted. What is more, the wives, being condemned to a life of unnatural continence, need an army of eunuchs to keep out intruders and to maintain the peace among them. When the women slaves, unmarried, of the inmates are counted in, a formidable total emerges of both sexes who are sterilized for the pleasure of one single man. Hence, Constantinople and Isfahan, the two largest towns in the world, are perishing of it looks like inanition, and would soon be destroyed were it not that almost every century whole nations are brought in to repeople them, quote unquote. Just reader's note here. I think the point he's making here. Yeah, now this Montesquieu, this author, is pointing out that even these harems are producing a handful of children. Maybe he's pointing out the negative aspect of the concept of the harem. You have these very virile young men who have been emasculated, essentially. They have surgically or whatever. Muslims were known to do that, and so that limits the ability of children. Whereas if you had all of these women and say each man had two or three wives and the men were unmarred, as it were, then you would have the capacity for much, much larger children produced. Because and to have such large numbers of women and only one man can do so much to produce these heirs, you see. So I think it's a commentary on the idea of the harem. There's limitations there, I think is what he's saying. Let's see here where we were. Okay, I think we'll start here. Of course, all this had often been said before, for example, by Ludovico Mauraccio in his long commentary on the Quran, by Laguerre, and by the travelers Chardin and Tavernier. Laguerre had ascribed the low density of population in Turkey to, quote, the excessive use of women, unquote. In Persia, notes Chardin, quote, this is a quote from Chardin, families are usually smaller than in France, owing, it is said, to the fact that the men and women have intercourse too early, and that far from husbanding their vigor, they stimulate it by medicines which wear it out by overheating it. Women stop having children very quickly in the East when they are about 27 or 30. This is an unquote now. Most of the early writers on population took the same line from Bodine in the 6th century through Sully. They concluded that monogamy was more prolific than polygamy. And Montesquieu buttresses his philosophic positions against Islam by voicing, through Rika, the suspicion that man's rule over woman is a veritable and unnatural tyranny. He goes on even further in his criticisms of the harem by making Roxanne take matters into her own hands. In the end, she commits suicide after being discovered to be conducting a, quote, guilty intrigue, unquote. But first hurls defiance at Uzbek, whom she upbraids for having been so naive as to have imagined that she could live merely to satisfy his desires. And she proudly proclaims that she has shed man-made shekels and replaced them by laws based on those of nature. The Persian letters then hover ambivalently between a Western, almost feminist condemnation of polygamy and a slightly shamefaced male adoration for its privileges and pleasures. In later life, Montesquieu moves sharply towards a more positive approach to that institution. Polygamy, he writes in his major work, The Spirit of Laws, published in 1747, is explicable in the East. It can be easily induced in hot climates, since in the southern climates there is a natural inequality of the sexes. Women are mere children when they marry, being mature at 8 or 9, and they are old at 20. It is natural, therefore, says the candid author, that by then their husband has transferred his affections to another wife. He is careful to emphasize that he is not making a case for polygamy, but only explaining the circumstances that favor its expansion in the East, and repeats his arguments against that institution. It is in the interest neither of the exploiting nor of the exploited sex. It deprives both of those of sexual satisfaction, while women are closely supervised by eunuchs. Large numbers of men are denied the possibility of having even one wife and turn to homosexuality. Alternatively, at the opposite extreme, they demand even greater variety and find a solution in adultery. This point was frequently made by critics of Islam. Looks like La Guitare observed that, quote, anyone who is accustomed to choosing between 3 or 4 women has already in his soul dispositions to debauchery and the seed of brutish lust. And, if need be, he should willingly go off and suborn 50 of his neighbors. However, Montesquieu's condemnation of polygamy is more apparent than real. Yes, he realizes that women lead an unnatural life in the seclusion of the harem, but in his belief in the decisive influence of the climate, he comes perilously close to admitting that such looks like immurement is necessary, or at least justifiable in the East. Quote, there are climates, unquote, he assures the reader, quote, where physical attraction is such that moral restraints are practically powerless, unquote. If a man and a woman are left alone, the result is a foregone conclusion. In such countries, what is needed is not precepts, but iron bars. In fact, women must not only be kept apart from men, but from one another. Morals are purer in proportion as claustration is more severe, unquote. He makes a most favorable comparison of the purity of morals among the claustrated women of Persia and Turkey and the appalling licentiousness and dissoluteness prevailing in the Portuguese dominion of Goa, a Catholic territory where women were not shut up. That looks like 16 and 11. It looks like this might be a reference to these pages in this book. Montesquieu seems to have suffered from something of a fixation on this score in his later years, for he paints a horrifying picture of female lubriciousness at Patani in southern Siam, where a woman have to wear a certain fixture to protect themselves from being raped. That's page 16 and then 10, it looks like. I don't think I've ever seen that word before, lubriciousness. All these precautions against feminine lust, however, have Asian circumstances in mind. What of Europe, where Montesquieu will concede the climate is moderate and the sexes have a certain equality, hence the failure of Islam to make any inroads? Readers note there, actually, that's not the case. Islam did almost take over Christian Europe. So he obviously didn't know his history very well. Going on, it continues that women may be allowed some freedom of movement. A closer look at his writings, however, makes it clear that even in the late latitudes of the North, Montesquieu comes very near to acquiescing in polygamy. He takes a most jaundiced view of the women of the age. They are immoral, debauched, and given to every conceivable vice. But it was not always so. Once upon a time, when the aristocracy lived on their estates in the country, life had flown by in an idyllic purity of morals. Only when it looks like the 16th, Louis the 16th, had seduced the nobility into uprooting itself and frequenting the court, did things take a turn for the worse. And ever since, the town had acquired an increasing weight in the nation's life. The situation had steadily deteriorated. The fact is that Montesquieu, under cover of a liberal approach, had his eyes fixed longingly on a largely imaginary Arcadian past. He hated the new urban civilization. He viewed the middle classes with distaste. He clung, as certain of his acts prove, to his worn-out class privileges, which impeded the creation of a modern state. He had the current preoccupation about population and hence thought that women were utterly unjustified in refusing to have a dozen children. And he also, at bottom, disliked women in general, who were, quote, totally ridiculous sex. He says here, who were a, quote, totally ridiculous sex. Even in the prettiest of them, quote unquote, he notes with sour malice, quote, there are days when I can see how they will look when they are old, unquote. And if he spent a considerable part of his time pursuing them, he neatly turns his success into an accusation of feminine fickleness, quote, all husbands are plain, unquote. Reader's note, I think what he is saying there is that he is expounding his own self feelings of inadequacy in that he seems unable to make many inroads into wiling or attracting the opposite sex. That's an interesting little comment there, isn't it? Okay. In fact, the trouble about French society at the time was, in his view, that women were given too high a status. He regrets the days when, as with the Samnites of old, and the most beautiful maidens were distributed, much as it were gold medals, to the most courageous, virtuous youths, a splendid custom. He entitles his subsection of his book. It looks like 7 and 16. I think these numbers here might be chapters, possibly, or page numbers, perhaps. Women, he notes elsewhere, have far too many rights in marriage, for, quote, one is ruined if one survives one's wife, or the children are ruined if one does not, unquote. The drift of this argument is clear. In order to tilt the balance in favor of marriage, concubinage should be banned, at least so long as polygamy and divorce are also banned. Otherwise, he asked, who will ever marry? But concubinage, as he well knew, could not be done away with by a stroke of the pen. Divorce he was in favor of, but its introduction would go only a small way to remedy the situation. If, he contended, quote, only marriages populate, the unquote, the answer was obviously to make polygamy legal. Montesquieu comes as near to the conclusion inherent in his arguments as he ever did in the revealing dictum, quote, it is alleged that the Turks are wrong and that women must be led and not tyrannized. For my part, I maintain that they must either command or obey, unquote. For him, there was no doubt that the, quote, ridiculous sex, unquote, should obey, and preferably a la turca. It is a far cry from even the most, let me read that again. It is a far cry from even the ostensible liberalism of the Persian letters. Montesquieu, however, like so many other European thinkers, never took the plunge, even in his private diaries. Had he done so, it is certain that his influence would not have been so great. As it was, his views on marriage carried great weight right up to the beginning of the present century, where he was still being quoted as an authority on polygamy by Leroux's Encyclopedia. That's an interesting little fact, isn't it? The respect paid to his opinions can only be described as deplorable. His theory that climates determined customs and morals was discounted even in his own day, and is now completely abandoned, at least in the extreme and simplified form in which he expounded it. What is more, his conception of the Oriental husband as lord of creation is largely a figment of his imagination. As Lady Mary Wortley Montagu pointed out in an amusing letter, monogamy was the rule rather than the exception in Turkey, and women, far from being poor, downtrodden creatures, indulged in affairs with a freedom and frequency which many of their Western sisters must have envied. Protected as they were by the complete anonymity of their robes and hoods. Indeed, they even made the first advances in many cases. The Greek poet Gerard de Nerval made the same point with devastating wit when describing conditions in Egypt in the middle of the 19th century. Reader's note here, it seems to put aside the claim, doesn't it, when you read about these accounts, that it's like in some generations, you have the older folks saying this generation's going to the dogs. Well, you never really know how badly something is going to the dogs, quote unquote, unless you start reading some of this torrid historical stuff, because this man is describing a society which you might think was more chaste due to the influence of Islam, but far from it. Women are committing adultery with anyone they can get in their bed at will, and it's kind of a negative aspect there in those cultures. But remember, this is coming from one man, Montesquieu, who is opining on, in some cases, the negative aspects of the harem of the Muslims. But in other cases, he relents and says if it were done in a proper way, or at least implies such, maybe it would be better, possibly. Okay, that concludes our reading for today. Next time we have chapter 7, it looks like, Muslim and Christian dogs. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. I tried to get through it as best I could.